The principles of natural law, in which the true systems of morality and civil government are established, and the different sentiments of Gortius, Hobbes, Puffendorf, Barbeyrac, Locke, Clarke, Hutchinson, occasionally considered. Okay. Written in 1748. Chapter 1 of the nature of man, considered with regard to right of the understanding and whatever is relative to his faculty. Part 1, Chapter 1, the general principles of right. My design is to inquire into those rules which nature alone prescribes to man, in order to conduct him safely to the end, which everyone has, and indeed ought to have, in view, namely, true and solid happiness. The system or assemblage of these rules, considered as so many laws imposed by God on man, is generally distinguished by the name natural law. This science includes the most important principles of morality, jurisprudence, and politics. That is, whatever is most interesting in respect as well to man as to society. There can be nothing, therefore, more deserving of the application of a rational being, of a being that has its perfection and felicity seriously at heart. A just knowledge of the maxims we ought to follow in the course of life is the principal object of wisdom, and virtue consists in putting them constantly in practice, without being ever diverted from so noble a pursuit. The idea of right, and much more that of natural right, are undoubtedly relative to the nature of man. 'Tis from this nature, therefore, from the constitution and state of man, that we are deduced to the principles of the science. The word right, droit, D-R-O-I-T, is originally signification. Its original signification comes from the verb droit, D-I-R-I-G-O, which implies to conduct a person to some sort of end by the shortest road. Right, therefore, in its proper and most general sense, and that to which all others must be reduced, is whatever directs or is well directed. This being permissed, the first thing we have to examine is whether man is susceptible of direction and rule in respect to his actions, that we may attempt with a greater probability of success. We are to trace matters to their very origin, and ascending as high as the nature and constitution of man, we must there unravel the principles of his actions and the several states that properly belong to him, in order to demonstrate afterwards in what manner and how far he is susceptible to direction in his conduct. This is the only method of knowing what is right and what is not. Man is an animal endowed with understanding and reason, a being composed of an organized body and a rational soul. With regard to his body, he is pretty similar to other animals, having the same organs, properties, and wants. This is a living body, organized, and composed of several parts. A body that moves of itself and feeble in its commencement, increases gradually in its progress by the help of nourishment, till it arrives to a certain period in which it appears in its flower and vigor, from whence it insensibly declines to old age, which conducts at length to dissolution. This is the ordinary course of human life, unless it happens to be abridged by some malady or accident. But man, besides the marvelous disposition of his body, has likewise a rational soul, which eminently discriminates him from brutes. 'Tis by this noble part of himself that he thinks, and is capable of forming just ideas of the different objects that occur to him, of comparing them together, or inferring from known principles unknown truth, of passing a solid judgment on the mutual sentiments or agreements of things, as well on the relations they bear on us, of deliberating on what is proper or improper to be done, and of determining consequently to act one way or another. The mind recollects what is past, joins it with the present, and extends its views to futurity. It is capable of penetrating into the cause, progress, and consequence of things, and of discovering, as it were, at one glance, the entire course of life, which enables it to lay in a store of such things as are necessary for making a happy career. Besides, in all this, it is not subject to a constant series of uniform and invariable options, but finds itself at liberty to act or not act, to suspend its actions and motions, to direct and manage them as it thinks proper. Such is the general idea we are to form of the nature of man. What results from hence is that there are several sorts of human actions. Some are purely spiritual, as to think, to reflect, to doubt, and others are merely corporal, as to breathe, to grow. And some there are that may be called mixed, in which the soul and body have both a share in being produced by their joint concurrence and consequence of union with God, has established between these two constituent parts, such as to speak, to walk. Those actions, which either in their origin or direction depend on the soul, are called human or voluntary. All the rest are termed merely physical. The soul, therefore, the principle of human action, and these actions cannot be objects of rule, but inasmuch they are produced and directed by those noble faculties with which man has been enriched by his Creator. Hence it is necessary to enter into a particular inquiry concerning this subject, and to examine closely into the faculties and operations of the soul, in order to discover in what manner they concur to the production of human action. This will help us at the same time to unfold the nature of these actions, to assure ourselves whether they are really susceptible to rule, and how far they are subject to human command. Let man reflect but ever so little on himself. Sense and experience will soon inform him that his soul is an agent who actively displays itself by a continued series of different operations, which, having been distinguished by separate names, are likewise attributed to different faculties. The chief of these faculties are the understanding, will, and liberty. The soul, indeed, a simple being, but this does not hinder us when we attend to its different ways of operating, from considering it as a subject in which different powers of acting reside, and from giving different denominations to these powers. If we consider the thing in this manner, we shall find it we shall find it will give a greater exactness and perspicuity of our ideas. Let us remember, therefore, that these faculties are nothing else but the different powers of acting inherent in the soul, by means of which it performs all operations. The principle of the soul, that which constitutes the fundamental part of being, and serves, as it were, for its intrinsic light, is the understanding. We may define it that faculty of power by which the soul perceives and forms ideas of things in order to come at the knowledge of truth. Truth may be taken here in two significations, either for the nature, state, and mutual relations of things, or for the ideas agreeable to this nature, state, and relations. To have knowledge, therefore, of truth. To have knowledge, therefore, of truth is to perceive things such as they are in themselves, and to form ideas concerning them conformable to their nature. Wherefore we must set out with acknowledging as a fixed and uncontestable principle that the human understanding is naturally right and has within itself a strength sufficient to arrive at the knowledge of truth and to distinguish it from error, especially in things wherein our respective duties are concerned, and which are requisite to form man from a virtuous, honorable, and quiet life. Provided, however, he employs all the care and attention that lies in his power. Sense and experience concur to convince us of the truth of this principle, which is the hinge, as it were, whereupon the whole system of humanity turns. It cannot be called in question without sapping the foundation and entirely subverting the whole structure of society, because this would be annulling all manner of distinction between truth and error, good and evil, and by a natural consequence of this subversion, we should find ourselves reduced to the necessity of doubting everything, which is the highest pitch of human extravagance. Those who pretend that reason and its faculties are depraved in such a manner as to be no longer capable of serving as a sure and faithful guide to man, either in respect to his duties or particularly with regard to religion, do not reflect that they have adopted for their basis of their system a principle destructive of all truth, and consequently of religion. Thus, we see that the sacred scripture, far from establishing any such maxim, assures us that when the Gentiles which have not the law do by nature the things contained in the law, those having not the law are a law to themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness. True it is that a bad education, vicious habits, and irregular passions may obfuscate the mind, and that neglect, levity, prejudices precipitate men frequently into the grossest errors in point of religion and morals. But this proves only that men may make a bad use of their reason, and not that natural rectitude of the faculties is subverted. What we have still to say concerning this point will help set it in a clearer light. Let us proceed now to a closer inquiry into the operations of the understanding, the perception or view and knowledge of things, as commonly formed by the concurrence of two actions, one from the object and is the impression which the object makes on us, the other from the mind, and is properly a glance or simple look of the soul on the object as it desires of knowing. But as a first look, it is not always sufficient. 'Tis necessary that the mind should apply itself for some time to a serious consideration of the object, to the end it may acquire a just knowledge of things, and form therefore exact ideas. This application with which the soul continues to view the object in order to know it well is called attention, and it turns itself different ways to consider the object on all sides. That is termed examine or inquiry. We may therefore affirm that the perception or knowledge of things depends entirely in respect to the mind on its natural vigor and attention. 'Tis by these helps, drawn from his own fund, that man attains at length a clear and distinct knowledge of things and their relations, as also of ideas and the conformity of these ideas with their origins. In short, that he acquires knowledge of truth. We give the name of evidence to this clear and distinct view of things and their mutual relations, a point to which we should be particularly attentive, for this evidence being the essential character of truth, or the sure mark whereby one cannot help distinguishing it. The consequence is that it necessarily produces such an internal conviction as forms the highest degree of certainty. 'Tis true that all objects do not present themselves with so strong a light that, notwithstanding the great care of application a man may use, all that he is frequently able to attain is only a glimmering light, which, according to its strength or weakness, produces different degrees of probability and seeming truth. But this must be absolutely the case of everything, of every being, whose faculties are limited. 'Tis sufficient that man, in respect to this distinction and state, is capable of knowing with certainty those things which concern the perfection and happiness, his perfection and happiness, and moreover that he is able to distinguish between probability and evidence, as also between the different degrees of probability, in order to proportion his assent to these differences. Now a person need enter but ever so little into himself and reflect on the operations of his mind, to be convinced beyond any possibility of doubt that man is really possessed of this discernment. The senses taken from this sensitive faculty, the imagination also, and the memory, must all reduce to the understanding. In fact, the senses, considered in this manner, are nothing else but the understanding itself, inasmuch as it makes use of the senses and organs of the body to perceive corporal objects. The imagination likewise is nothing but the understanding, as it perceives absent objects, not in themselves, but by their images formed in the brain. The memory in time is no more than the understanding, considered as possessed of the faculty of retaining the ideas it forms of those things, and capable of representing them to itself whenever there is occasion. Advantages that depend particularly on the care we take in repeating frequent those ideas. From what has been hitherto said with regard to the understanding, it follows that the object of this faculty of the soul is truth, with all the acts and means that lead us to it. Upon this supposition, the perfection of the understanding consists in the knowledge of truth. This being the end for which it is designed, there are two things among others opposite to this perfection: ignorance and error. which are two maladies, as it were, of the soul. Ignorance is no more than a privation of ideas or knowledge, but error is a nonconformity or opposition of our ideas to the nature and state of things. Error being therefore the subversion of truth is much more opposite than ignorance, which is a kind of medium between truth and error. 'Tis to be observed here that we do not speak purely to know what these things are in themselves. Our main design is to consider them as principles of our actions. In this light, ignorance and error, therefore, naturally distinct from one another, are generally mixed, as it were, and confounded, insomuch that whatsoever is said of one ought equally to be applied to the other. Ignorance is frequently the cause of error. But joined or separate, they follow the same rules and produce the same effect by the influence they have over our actions or omissions. Perhaps, were we to examine into things exactly, error only, properly speaking, can be looked upon as a principle of action, not simply ignorance, which being nothing more of itself than the privation of ideas, cannot be productive of anything. There are several sorts of ignorance and error, whole different divisions 'tis proper for us to observe. Error considered in respect to its object as either of law or of fact. With regard to its origin, ignorance is voluntary or involuntary. Error is vincible or invincible in relation to the influence of the error on a particular affair or action. It is esteemed essential or accidental. Error is of the law or fact, according as people are mistaken either in the respect to the disposition of the law or in regard to a fact that is not sufficiently known. For instance, it would be an error of the law were a prince to suppose himself entitled to declare war against a neighboring state only because it insensibly increases its strength and power. Such was likewise the error so commonly formerly among the Greeks and Romans, that it was allowable for parents to expose their children. On the contrary, the idea Abimelech had of Sarah, the wife of Abraham, by taking her for an unmarried person, was an error of the fact. The ignorance a person lies under through his own fault, or an error contracted by neglect, and which may have been avoided by using all possible care and attention, is a voluntary ignorance or a vincible, formidable error. Thus, the polytheism of the pagans was a vincible error, for they had only make a right use of their reason in order to be convinced that there was no necessity for supposing a plurality of gods. The same may be said of an opinion established among most of the ancients, that piracy was lawful against those whom there was no treaty subsisting, and that was allowable to consider them as enemies. Ignorance is voluntary, and error invincible, when they are such as could neither have been prevented nor removed, even by all care and endeavors that are morally possible, that is, judging of them accordingly to the constitution of human things and of common life. Thus, the ignorance of the Christian religion under which the people of America labored before they had any communication with the Europeans was an involuntary and invincible ignorance. In time, we understand by an essential error that whose object is some necessary circumstance in the affair, and which for this very reason has a direct influence on the action done in consequence thereof, insomuch that were it not for this error, the action never would have been done. Hence, this is a denomination, likewise an efficacious error, by necessary circumstance. We are to understand those which are necessary and required, either by the very nature of the thing or by the intention of the agent, formed at the proper time, and made known by suitable indications. 'Twas thus, for instance, an essential error in the Trojans at the taking of their own town. I'm sorry. 'Twas, for instance, the essential error of the Trojans at the taking of their town to shoot their darts against their own people, mistaking them for enemies because of their being armed after the Greek manner. Again, a person marries another man's wife, supposing her to be a maid, or not knowing that her husband is still living. This regards the very nature of things, and is, of course, an essential error. On the contrary, accidental error is that which has no necessary connection of itself with the affair, and consequently cannot be considered as the real cause of the action. A person abuses or insults another, taking him for somebody else, or because he supposes the prince is dead, as it had been groundlessly reported. These are errors merely accidental, which subsist indeed in the mind of the agent and have accompanied him in action, but cannot be considered as its real cause. 'Tis likewise observable that these different qualities of ignorance or error may concur and be found united in the same cause. 'Tis thus an error of the fact may be either essential or accidental, or both. The one and the other may be either voluntary or involuntary, vincible or invincible. So much may suffice for what regards the understanding. Let us proceed now to examine into the other faculties of the soul, which concur also to the production of human actions.